Hey everybody, it's that Sunday School Girl of thatsundayschoolgirl.com. Welcome to the lesson for this Sunday, November 26th. I hope that everyone had a fantastic Thanksgiving holiday. I hope that you ate too much, enjoyed your family, and took time to reflect on every blessing that God has given us. I've probably done a little too much of that myself, which is why it is 1:48 in the morning on Saturday morning, or Friday going into Saturday, and I am just getting in from just still hanging out with my family. I guess we don't get tired of each other. We had dinner on Thursday. We had a fish fry on Friday, and we pull out all of the leftovers from Friday, and that's how we get rid of everything. So we do a 2-day celebration, and we weren't tired yet. We've been to a paint party with the ladies tonight, and then everybody met up at main event. So we've done a lot. But I was so feeling responsible because I hadn't uploaded this video and spent my time with you. So I am glad that you're here again. I hope that you all have more fun planned for the weekend. And yes, I do hope that that includes Sunday school. If you're new around here, welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web. And even at 1:49 in the morning, I am thrilled that you are here. Do me a favor, everyone, make sure that you are subscribed to this channel. So make sure that you hit the button that says subscribe, and then there's a little bell that will give you notifications immediately when content is posted. We do these videos each week for 3 reasons: to make sure that you are prepared for Sunday school, that you've made it a priority, that when you get there you're able to participate, but most of all, when you leave, you understand how to activate God's Word in your everyday lives. Listen, after I get this video up, I'm going to take a quick nap, and I'm going to be back on in the morning at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, November 25th at 9 a.m. I will be on with 2 very special young women who were scheduled to be my guests last week. For those of you who joined the Facebook Live training session, thank you so much. It was great. It was interactive. It was a lot of fun. I was having technical difficulties, so I learned a couple of things last week, so we're going to try to include the improvements, but most of all feature those 2 young women. That's Sister Vernisha Akinloton and Natasha Pruitt, who are both amazing children's Sunday school teachers, and they each have information that they're going to share with you. So if you are a teacher of children, I encourage you to be on that Facebook Live session with us in the morning at 9 o'clock a.m. Central. If you have questions that you'd like to ask ahead of time, feel free to email those to me. You'll also have the live interactive format while we're online, so you don't want to miss it. It was really energetic last week, and so many people were like, can they record early? What can we do? Like, people did not want to disengage from last week's session, so make sure that you tune in at 9 o'clock a.m. Central. You have to be friends on my Facebook page, That Sunday School Girl. So make sure that you like that page and you set your notifications for the Facebook Live session on tomorrow. Listen, I don't have anything else to share with you at 1:51 in the morning. Let's get into the lesson for this week. Our lesson title is Remembering the Covenant. The Bible basis is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 through 34. The Bible truth. Paul exhorted believers to remember these promises through celebrating the Lord's Supper in a way that affirms the covenant it embodies. Our memory verse is verse 25, and the lesson aim is that we will explore the meaning of the Lord's Supper as a time of covenant remembrance, aspire to take of the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner as covenant partners with God, and express daily through our lifestyle the covenant implications of the Lord's Supper. This is our final lesson in this quarter study, Covenant with God. And we've learned so much about covenant, going back to the rainbow, bringing us up to the new covenant in the last 2-week studies. And this week, we're going to talk about remembering. I hope that you took a dictionary out. Even though remembering is a common word, you know that I'm a fan of looking up what that means so that we really understand why this topic was chosen. By definition, remembering means to have in or be able to bring to one's mind an awareness of something or someone that you have seen, known, or experienced in the past. And that's exactly what we're to take away from the covenant. God wanted us to understand. He wants us to remember that we've experienced, that we've received through Him by grace. Now, when you think about things that we remember, there are lots of things that we remember. You may remember your first day of school, your favorite teacher. You may remember the day you got your driver's license. You remember your wedding date. You remember the birth of your first child. And then there are things that may be kind of challenging when we think about those memories. Like, where were you on September 11th? I remember where I was the day that my best friend passed away at the age of 35. I remember the night that they called and told me at 11:15 at night that a code blue had been called on my father. I remember February the 20th of this year sitting in class and getting a message that my grandfather was being transported for the last time to the ER. So sometimes there are things that are challenging for us to remember, but at the same time, I was thinking about this yesterday, even as we sat down to our Thanksgiving experience with our family and with family and friends around. There were so many things that we remembered. We remembered things that we used to do. We talked about family members who weren't at the table with us, who had passed on, things that we do as tradition, the way that certain foods were prepared, and we shared in those memories good times and laughs. But especially as we talked about the food, we talked about things that my grandparents made and how things were prepared, and even how certain recipes today are just things that have been handed down from generation to generation. And we realize that a lot of what we do today is impacted by the tradition that was passed on to us. That's what we're going to see in this week's lesson. There was a tradition that was being passed down, and the next generation, the succeeding generations, were not as careful with holding dear those traditions and remembering them with honor and with respect. You know, when you don't remember something, remember how special it is, and you don't work hard to preserve it, the danger is that you will forget about it and you'll take it for granted, and you will possibly start to treat that special thing that was passed down in a reckless manner. Again, that is the setting in today's lesson. Paul is the writer, and he's writing to the church at Corinth, and he's having to bring a word of correction. There's been a lot going on in Corinth, and their minds are just everywhere except being focused on holding dear and keeping things sacred the way they should be. They're in a lot of different places, and so the agape feast is really where things are going wrong. Remember, agape is a word that means love, but this feast that they were having was no longer about love. As a matter of fact, it had gotten to the point that what was supposed to be a time of honoring God was now dishonoring God. And so Paul writes to them, and he asks them basically, why do you even bother doing this? They had forgotten the focus of the feast altogether. It was no longer about brotherly love. Quite frankly, it was now a turn up. It was no longer a holy order, a holy holiday, but people were getting drunk. The wealthy were eating before the poor. And in many cases, this would have been the best meal that the poor would have had all week long. And when they were coming together, it should have been a time when the church being together should have been made better. In fact, that was the strength at one point of the church being together. It was that they were enriched by the doctrine. They broke bread together. They fellowshiped. They prayed. But again, something changed. And instead of being better when they came together, he says things are actually worse. Like, you all are having congregational gatherings, and instead of building each other up spiritually, people leave here worse than when they showed up. Can you imagine if our churches were that way? That when people came into those doors looking for an experience with God, they left worse off than when they walked into our doors. That was the case in Corinth, and ultimately it became a point of divisiveness in the church because the people did not remember what was important, and they were destroying what was supposed to be the spiritual environment of the church. And Paul says, do you think that I'm really going to cheer you on for this kind of behavior? There is nothing productive about what they were doing. As a matter of fact, it was hurtful. It was very harmful to the church. So this agape fellowship, it was more like a weekly potluck, and they started to combine that with the Lord's Supper. And that wasn't really the problem, that they were getting basically a 2-for-1, but it was that they were no longer treating the Lord's Supper as special. It no longer had sacred meaning. And so again, Paul is writing as a corrective instruction to show them how they should be handling the Lord's Supper. This is not, a drive through your favorite fast food location. That's not what the Lord's Supper experience is. It was supposed to be special and sacred. Spirit. And so Paul is basically jarring them in his writing saying, what are you doing? Why are you handling it this way? Why are you coming to the Lord's table drunk? Why won't you wait for the poor to eat first? What in the world is going on? Now, as you read this week's lesson, you'll note that it's a familiar scripture. In many of our communion services, you hear this exact scripture read. My church recognizes communion as one of our ordinances. And so part of the service, when we make that transition, you'll hear this read before the communion service takes place. And the communion is really a service that is for those who have committed themselves to Jesus Christ. And we'll see that in the lesson. As a matter of fact, in our service, there is a space that our pastor makes that allows those who choose not to participate, who elect not to participate. It's not a time to feel badly, but it's a choice. And if you know that that's not something that you want to share in, there's even a space where we allow people to leave and make their exit, and then we offer the Lord's Supper. So Paul says this, basically, let me help you focus, Corinth. And he starts in verse 23. And he indicates, first of all, where he gets his apostolic authority. He wants the church to know that what he's sharing with them is not just something that he's made up on his own. He said, but I've received this from the Lord. I wasn't at the Lord's Supper, and that was before my time, but I got this directly from the Lord through revelation, and he gave this to me, and now it's a message that I give to you. I have to communicate this to you. I submit it to you. It's the Lord's Supper that we're talking about, and you have to note, since it's the Lord's Supper, who's the host? It is the Lord. This is not your party. It's not your personal event. It's not about you. But every time you do this, every time you sit at the Lord's Supper, you sit as his guest at his table. And you have to realize when you're going into someone else's space, you have to watch how you behave yourself. You in someone else's space. When it's your event, you can do things however you want to do it. But this is the Lord's Supper, and he is the host. And again, the people in Corinth had questions. There were things that they didn't understand. Maybe they didn't have the context. And so here he gives historical context. He talks about the night that the Lord was betrayed, and he's taking them back to the time of the Passover feast. And it was the last night that Jesus was with his disciples, the Passover feast, that time of commemoration. Again, remembering. They were always to remembering their deliverance from Egypt, remembering what God had done. But this was the last time that Jesus would sit with his disciples before he was crucified. The story is accounted in St. John chapter 13. It was the night before he was crucified, and he and the disciples were celebrating the Passover. I noted this, that Paul is addressing attitudes and actions. And even in going back to reference the night that Jesus was betrayed, Jesus was the chief among them, and he became servant. Remember, he even washed their feet in that last experience. He was a servant to them. And so even in his own attitude at his own table, Paul was pointing out, you all aren't even being servants to anyone. You are taking the best for yourselves, and you're not even thinking about things. This whole being giving to drunkardness. That wasn't the spirit of the Lord's Supper. Paul references also that on this night that Jesus knew he would be betrayed. As he sat at this final supper, he knew that there was a betrayer among him, and that person was Judas. And then he specifically outlines the process of the night's meal. There was, first of all, the bread, the unleavened bread, which was a symbol. This was not the actual body of Jesus Christ, not bread that turned into flesh, but a symbol of the body of Jesus Christ, which he broke it and instructed them to eat it to remember him. Do this in remembrance of me. It was not to partake in what I am going through, but so that you will remember. This bread represents, again, his body that was broken for us. Jesus said, I am the living bread. If anyone eats, he lives forever. And we know that he made the sacrifice for the sins of the world. Again, remember that nothing has happened at this point, but Jesus knows that this is the last time that he will sit for this type of meal and have this kind of experience with those disciples before his death. the true bread from heaven. That was Jesus Christ, without sin. And when we today take communion and we eat of the bread, it gives us that point of connection and interaction, a personal way to remembering the suffering death of Jesus Christ. This observation is a time for us not to even just reflect on what he did, but to understand and reflect on why he did it. For the love that he had for the world, he gave his life. And the breaking of the bread reminds us of the horrible death that he died on the cross, being beaten, being crucified, being wounded for our transgressions, and bruised for our iniquities. And next, Paul writes that he picks up the cup, and very similarly, he instructs them to take the cup and to drink of the cup. This cup being the new covenant in my blood. And we've talked about the new covenant for the last 2 weeks, and we know that Jesus fulfilled the new covenant. Again, remember, the Passover was a celebration of their deliverance from Egypt. And there were 4 cups representing the promises that God gave to Israel that were passed around at strategic times during this celebratory meal. There were bitter herbs and lamb and wine that were served and psalms that were read. And all of this was about remembering what had been done. And so this wine, this blood, representative of Jesus' blood, was given, and they were told to drink of it. Again, not to drink of actual blood, not blood that would turn into wine, but wine as a symbol of the blood of Jesus Christ, so that we would remember. And he said that as often as you do this, every time you do this, you're going to do this again and again. You're going to revisit this experience with Christ every single time. That's what you do. Every time you take the Lord's Supper, it should not be done out of ritual. It shouldn't be done just out of habit. It shouldn't be done because someone told you to do it. But every time you are revisiting the experience with Jesus Christ. Verses 28 and 29 are basically a warning. Paul is issuing a warning that you are to treat the Lord's Supper with reverence. It is, again, this is not just a 2-piece meal that you pick up at the local chicken shack, but this is a reverent time, and it calls for self-reflection, self-examination. You don't just come and sit and eat, but you have to prepare yourself for this experience. When you approach this experience without any thought at all, you are guilty of missing the entire point of the communion. It is, in essence, to disregard and to dishonor everything that Christ did on the cross. And it also shows that you don't understand the meaning and you don't understand why this is personal. But he tells them to take personal inventory. You've got to examine yourself. Now, this was not to exclude anyone from the experience, and it was not to see if you were worthy of the sacrifice, because none of us deserved the sacrifice, but it was to cause each of us to think about, what have we done to honor his sacrifice? And unworthily wasn't about the person, but it was about the manner and the attitude in which the Lord's Supper was taken. How have you remembered the sacrifice, not just in that moment that it's time to partake of the Lord's Supper, but how have you thought about his sacrifice in the way that you live every single day? It's a moment when you think about how you are living. Are you walking in known sin? If you take communion, if you sit at the Lord's Supper and you walk in known sin, you dishonor the sacrifice. You take it. That's what it means when it says you take it unworthily. You have not been made worthy because you're not walking worthy. And it's about preparing your heart so that you're not making a mockery of the sacrifice. And that's what Paul is saying. You don't want to make a mockery of this sacrifice, because it's a time that we're thanking God for what he's done, his forgiveness and his sacrifice of his son. And again, we're talking about people who were coming to the Lord's table in a drunken state. So they were dishonoring what was taking place. Note what the charge is. He says that when you do this, here's what you're guilty of. You're guilty of the body and the blood. Note the charge, guilty of the body and the blood. Notice I was careful to point out that when he broke bread, he gave bread, and then he gave wine. But this is the first time that we've seen the reference directly to body and blood. We've seen them as symbols before, but now when you take communion unworthily, when you sit at the Lord's Supper unworthily, now you're guilty of the actual body and the actual blood. Again, what we've seen before was memorials and remembrance, but here we see the actual body and blood. In other words, it is hypocrisy. It is hypocritical. You are guilty of the body and the blood when you take communion, sit at the Lord's Supper unworthily. It is basically to disregard the true work that was done on the cross through the atoning blood shed of Jesus Christ. Verses 29 and 30 talk about consequences. Consequences of irreverent conduct, basically, at the Lord's Supper. And what does that get you when you've done something that doesn't line up? It puts you in a position where those consequences could mean corrective discipline, corrective action from God. And that's what Paul says. It's clear that in Corinth, there were people who were weak and who were sick in the community. And Paul basically says, this is why. You're trying to figure out what your issue is or what the root cause is. The issue is this right here. You are being disciplined. And the Bible tells us this, that if God does not discipline you, you're not a son. And so because he loves us, because he wants us back on the right track, he will bring correction and discipline. And he says, for this cause, there are a lot of you that are weak and are sickly among you, and many of you sleep. There had been death in that community. And he says that the issue is that they were not discerning the Lord's body. In other words, they were not able to distinguish or separate the Lord's Supper as being different, more special, more important than any of their other meals. They did not recognize the greatness that was right in front of them. How could they claim to love God and mock what he had done in their lives by coming to the table in a manner that was unworthy? And then he says, judge yourselves. He tells them that Corinth was busy judging others. But again, Paul gives very specific instructions. This is all about, this entire passage only talks about self-reflection. It didn't talk about anyone else making a decision about whether anyone else was worthy to sit at the table or to give a list of anything that anyone had seen anyone else doing. It simply said to let a man examine himself. You need to look at yourself. What have you done? Do you sit at the table worthily? You need to look at you. So we're told to judge ourselves. Verses 33 and 34 round out Paul's instruction. He basically tells them, wait. Just wait for everyone. Basically have good manners when you come to the Lord's Supper. This is a love meal and everyone is supposed to partake of it. Make sure that everyone gets enough to eat. Not for one group to eat well and someone goes home hungry. And he says that if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. This was not intended to be what many of us experienced on yesterday with a large Thanksgiving spread. It was a common meal where everyone was supposed to get something. So eat at home if you're hungry, but when you come here, this is a different occasion. And he reminds them that if you don't, lest you do that, you face the judgment of God. And at the end of the day, it's just food, people. It is just food. It's not worth God's judgment for just food. Again, they were commemorating the time that a holy God redeemed sinful man. And much of this instruction has been very personal reflection. But he says, let that man, let you examine yourself, judge yourself. And Paul basically writes, these are things that need to be fixed immediately. And the rest of what's going on, I'll set that in order when I come, when I get back to the area where you are. So this is the lesson. Let me share with you my key learnings from the week. The first thing is really not a key learning, but I want you to check out this week's lesson in the Message Bible. It was absolutely my favorite version of all the passages that I read this week. I love the plain text of the language, and I just love the impact that it really just cuts to the core of what this lesson is about. So check it out in the Message Bible. Key learnings, here they go. first is that communion is our time of remembrance of what Jesus did for us and the blessing that he gave us. And that's something that we shouldn't just think about at Easter or even just at communion, but it is in how we live every day. We honor God every single day with our lives. We honor the sacrifice that he made on the cross in every decision and everything we do each day. It is our opportunity, when the Bible says that we are salt and light, and that when we present the best versions of the God in us, that the world sees that. It's the light that draws others to the God that we serve. The second thing is that when you receive something from God, you have to allow it to become meaningful to you first and apply it to you first, and then you can share that with others. Remember that when Paul wrote in verse 23, he says basically, hey, I'm giving this to you as God gave it to me, but it means something to me and I hold it dear, but it has to sit and resonate with you before you can pour out and it can be a blessing to anyone else. The next piece is watch for the fact that the fake can sit right among things that are real. And we saw that Judas is mentioned in the lesson, that Jesus, in the night that he was betrayed, as he sat there in a very sincere and real experience, that there was something that was not genuine sitting right in the midst of it. And you just have to be aware that it can be sitting there. Even when we're doing good things, there can be something not genuine sitting in our midst. And we need the Spirit of God to help us discern that and to know how we should move and what we should say and what we should do. But God will give us what to do. And then next, when we come together to remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, when we come together in our churches, when we come together in worship, that when we come together as a community of saints, we should be better and not worse as a result of our coming together. The last piece is, again, really, this lesson has so much self-reflection. You need to think about you, and you don't need anyone else to tell you what you're doing, because you live with you every day. But every single day we should be taking self-inventory of what we're doing. Does it please God? Every action that we take, we should be asking, does it please God? Does it mean that we're perfect? No. Will we make mistakes? Yes. But every single day, it should be our desire to make sure that we are taking inventory of ourselves and submitting ourselves to God to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be as His agents in the earth. This again is the lesson for this week. I look forward to anything that you got, any of your feedback, comments, things that you're going to bring out with your students or things that you're going to share in your class. I'd love to hear them in the comments. Again, if you're new, please say hello. Let me know how you found the channel. Don't forget to join me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock a.m. It's time for me to get a little nap now. I hope that you guys have a great rest of the weekend, and I will see you in Sunday school. Bye-bye.